Hello, everyone. Tonight, we begin with the most stubborn magic humans ever engineered, staying warm without fur, plugs, or mercy from the weather. From seal oil lamps that slow-cook the air, to breath-warm snow houses that hum like living lungs, to moss mattresses that steal heat back from the earth. This is the quiet technology of survival. Layers of fur, breath, and soil stitched into a portable climate. If this kind of oddly cozy anthropology hits the spot, feel free to like and subscribe only if it genuinely warms you up a little. Also, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I love seeing our little map of midnight spread across the globe. Now, lower the lights. Let a kettle whisper in the background. Wrap a blanket over your shoulders and settle your breathing with the room. We'll ease into the story together, one soft exhale at a time. It's funny, really. Evolution had millions of years to prepare the human body for Ice Age weather, and somehow decided, hey, let's go with mostly naked. No fur, no natural insulation, just skin and optimism. The woolly mammoth strutted around in a floor-length winter coat. The cave bear had a double layer of fuzz, and there we were, soft, pink, and shivering under the illusion that intelligence could keep us warm. If evolution were a fashion designer, humanity was its minimalist phase. Chic, impractical, and perpetually freezing. The Pleistocene wasn't kind to vanity. Temperatures dropped to the sort that made the air itself feel like sandpaper. And suddenly being clever wasn't enough. Clever had to start sewing. Archaeological sites from Siberia to France show the same desperate creativity. Bones turned to needles, tendons turned to thread, hides turned into something resembling pants. Early humans didn't invent clothing for modesty or aesthetics. They invented it because frostbite has a way of ruining one's day. Even then, the human body was a poor furnace. We radiate heat like broken light bulbs, inefficiently and inconsistently, which is why survival wasn't just about one person's warmth, but everyone's. The body became a heating unit in a larger human network. Families slept pressed together, breath fog mingling in the dark. A single fire in the middle, pulsing like a communal heart. You can almost imagine it, a cave full of lungs exhaling into the same invisible blanket, rhythmically raising the temperature by a few sacred degrees. The irony of our species' success is that it wasn't strength that saved us, or speed, or fangs, it was tenderness. People survived by proximity, by the art of touching without freezing. Anthropologists call it thermoregulation. The rest of us would just call it not dying. The earliest shelters weren't houses, they were bodies arranged strategically to keep the infants from turning blue and the elders from turning stiff. And in that warmth-sharing choreography, something remarkable happened. Emotion entered the evolutionary chat. To care was suddenly thermal strategy. Affection had survival value. Still, it wasn't enough. The Ice Age wasn't an event, it was a lifestyle, and the rent was astronomical. The skin alone couldn't keep pace with glaciers, so early humans began stealing warmth from the best designers available, animals. Watching how wolves curled in dens, how reindeer stood back to back in blizzards, how the world's real fur coats shrugged off the cold. Observation turned to imitation, imitation to invention. In every frozen plain, there's a story of someone realizing that the difference between life and death was the thickness of another creature's hide. Archaeologists have found awls and needles carved from mammoth ivory, still bearing microscopic wear marks from punching through skin and fur. Humanity's first attempt at engineering heat. The bodies that once hunted now borrowed, and wrapped in those borrowed skins, humans found not just warmth, but identity. The line between hunter and hunted blurred into something almost poetic, survival through appropriation. But fur was only the beginning. Beneath it lay a deeper discovery, something no animal had yet mastered. That warmth wasn't just a gift to wear, it was something to build. And from that moment, the cold stopped being an enemy and became a teacher. Every breath, every flicker of fire, every scrap of hide became a piece of architecture in the great experiment of human heat. Before walls, there were ribs. Before roofs, there were backs curved toward the wind. The first shelter wasn't something humans built, it was something they became. A pile of sleeping bodies pressed close enough for breath to fog the same cold air was humanity's original heating system. Not elegant, not sanitary, but effective. The Ice Age didn't care about dignity. It cared about calories. And warmth, as it turns out, is just another form of energy conservation, with a little love mixed in. Archaeologists call this huddling behavior. Poets might call it not freezing to death. Caves across Eurasia show signs of communal sleeping, animal bones used as makeshift pillows, soot-stained ceilings hovering over spaces just big enough for a small tribe to exhale into survival. Imagine the scene. The fire is a dull red smear in the dark. Every breath a small ghost drifting upward. People sleep in layers, mothers, infants, elders, hunters all, radiating body heat into one another like a living hearth. Not romantic, just necessary. Even now, remnants of this strategy linger in cultures that never forgot how to be mammals. Among the Inuit, children still sleep inside the hood of the mother's parka, their breath mingling with her own. The Sami of northern Scandinavia curl into circles under reindeer skins, creating a shared dome of heat and exhaustion. Among the San of southern Africa, small fires punctuate the camp. But it's the closeness, the silent agreement to stay within reach that keeps the frost from biting too deep. Civilization may have added walls, but the blueprint was already biological, survival by touch. The human species, in its infinite stubbornness, discovered that warmth could be negotiated, breath could be trapped, recycled, transformed. In a sealed cave or tent, a dozen lungs could turn freezing air into something almost bearable. The earliest shelters didn't need insulation or architecture. They needed bodies that trusted one another enough to share a single lungful of life. Thermodynamics met intimacy, and the result was prehistoric HVAC powered by affection and fatigue. Of course, this strategy came with, let's say, sensory challenges. The smell of people fermenting slowly under fur, the smoky sting of the fire, the constant dampness of breath condensing on stone. Hygiene wasn't invented yet, but body heat certainly was. Early humans lived inside a sauna of survival, humid, smelly, and miraculously effective. If the Ice Age had Yelp reviews, the caves would get 5 stars for temperature, 0 for ventilation. But it worked. So well, in fact, that the principle never went away. From the thatched huts of Iron Age villages to modern nomadic tents, the logic remains the same. Fewer gaps, smaller spaces, shared warmth. Even the shape of the human dwelling, the preference for circles, domes, and enclosures, reflects the physics of containment. Heat escapes from corners. Humans learned early on to avoid right angles like curses. Somewhere along the way, breath itself became sacred. The invisible cloud that kept families alive turned into symbol and ritual spirit, soul, pneuma. Across cultures, the act of breathing together took on spiritual weight because it had once been survival itself. In the cold, the line between exhaling and praying was thin. Both meant you were still alive. And once breath and flesh had proved their worth, attention turned outward to the world beyond the body. Because there, covered in fur and frost, wandered creatures who didn't shiver at all. Creatures that slept on snow and woke up dry. It didn't take long before humanity realized, if warmth could be borrowed from another's skin, then maybe the world's best shelter was already walking on 4 legs. At some point, humanity looked around and realized that every other creature on the tundra was dressed for the occasion. Wolves strutted through blizzards like runway models for the concept of survival. Musk oxen glistened with layers so thick they could trap sunlight. And then there was us, naked optimism wrapped in wishful thinking. It must have been humbling. The first time someone stared at a reindeer and thought, I could really use your outfit. This was the true birth of fashion, not Paris, not Milan, but some frostbitten valley in Ice Age Europe, where necessity invented couture. The earliest sewing kits, made of bone and ivory, were found at sites like Kostenki and Sungir in Russia. Awls, needles, tiny bits of corded sinew still clinging to them after tens of millennia. They weren't decorative tools, they were declarations of war against extinction. To pierce a hide and thread it shut was to stitch life back into the body. But it wasn't just about wearing fur, it was about understanding it. Observation turned humans into accidental zoologists. They noticed that caribou fur trapped air in hollow fibers, that rabbit pelts insulated better when worn inside out, that the skin of a seal could keep out water even when the wearer smelled like yesterday's fish market. This wasn't trial and error, it was slow, forensic learning. The science of stealing other species' heat without their consent. Some cultures still carry the memory of that bargain. The Inuit wore double layers of caribou hide, fur in, fur out. a perfect air-trapping sandwich. Siberian Ewenki herders wrapped themselves in reindeer pelts that breathed like living lungs. Even ancient Europeans stitched mammoth hides into shelter walls, so thick that archaeologists still find traces of smoke baked into their fibers. Warmth became a kind of collaboration between predator and prey, the ultimate recycling program. And there's a strange tenderness to it. Those hides weren't trophies, they were agreements. The animal's death wasn't just consumption, it was integration. To wear the skin of another creature was to admit dependence, to literally inhabit its resilience. In some Arctic languages, the word for clothing and the word for animal skin are the same. The separation between the living and the worn blurred until warmth itself felt borrowed, not owned. It's tempting to think this was the end of the story, humans dressing up as animals and finally beating the cold. But fur, for all its genius, was only a surface solution. Beneath the hides, beneath the layers, something subtler was waiting to be discovered. It wasn't the fur that mattered most, it was the air it held still. The true secret of warmth wasn't in the skin of another creature, but in the invisible space between hairs, between fibers, between breaths. And so, the great human experiment continued, from fur to fabric, from wearing warmth to building it. The first time someone realized that air itself could be trapped, stacked, and shaped, the idea of layering was born. Warmth became architecture, and the body, still small and hairless, learned to create its own weather. Somewhere between the last glacial tantrum and the first moment a human sighed, "I'm freezing," someone figured it out. Warmth wasn't hiding in fur or fire, it was in the air. Not moving air, not the gust slicing through your ribs, but the quiet air that stayed put. Stillness, it turns out, is the most underrated form of insulation. And so began one of humanity's finest inventions, layering, the prehistoric art of trapping silence between fabrics. To a modern mind, layering sounds obvious: sweater, coat, done. But 30,000 years ago, this was a revolution. It meant realizing that warmth could be engineered, not begged for. Archaeological finds from sites like Dolny, Vastanis in the Czech Republic, and Yana Rhinoceros, Hornsite in Siberia, suggest that humans weren't just wrapping hides around themselves. Randomly, they were constructing wearable ecosystems. Inner skins worn thin to trap air close to the body, outer hides fout to deflect wind and snow. It was thermal architecture in motion, centuries before anyone discovered mathematics to describe it. And oh, the variety. Layers of mammoth wool, fox fur, woven grasses, even bird feathers, all combined into composite systems that would make an engineer proud and a fashion critic confused. The principle was simple. Air is lazy. It hates to move. The more layers you stack, the more air you trap, and the more heat you keep. Early humans didn't talk about convection currents or R values, but they understood the gospel of puffiness, bulk equals life. The funny thing about this discovery is that it blurred the line between clothing and shelter. A double-layered reindeer parka was basically a mobile hut. Inuit seamstress's craftsmanship still humbles modern designers knew how to orient each hair follicle so moisture wicked outward while heat stayed in. Sami herders used layers of tanned skin and wool to create microclimates around their bodies, carrying the tundra's physics on their shoulders. Even the grass capes of prehistoric Japan used layering to make straw act like fur, proving that warmth could be cultivated out of almost anything if you just respected the air between. Of course, all this layering came with its challenges. Moving in 6 kilograms of frozen hide wasn't exactly graceful. Imagine running from a predator while sounding like a leather sofa trying to escape. But it was worth it. Those layers didn't just save lives, they changed how people thought about the world. Warmth was no longer something nature granted, it was something humans designed. And design had its poetry. The layering principle seeped into everything: architecture, bedding, even social behavior. Families began sleeping under multiple skins. Dwellings were built with double walls of turf and snow. And communities realized that survival was just another word for cooperation. The idea that heat could be trapped, stacked, shared, that was the real miracle of the Ice Age. But there was still one more frontier left in the war against cold. The invisible warmth of the breath. The same mist that fogged the morning air turned out to be the most intimate heating system of all. Because once people learned to clothe the body, the next challenge was to warm the space around it with nothing but lungs, rhythm, and the quiet architecture of breath. If fire was the sun humanity could steal, then breath was the one it could make on demand. Warmth, distilled through lungs. It's almost comical after all that effort, skinning animals, sewing hides, and building huts. It turned out the body had been exhaling central heating all along. Every breath a puff of invisible luxury, loaded with moisture and just enough warmth to raise the temperature of a small cave by a few degrees. Primitive, maybe effective. Absolutely. The secret lay in containment. Once humans stopped letting the wind steal their breath, the cold lost half its power. Inside a sealed snow house, for instance the igloo, carved with geometric precision from blocks of frozen water, exhaled warmth could lift interior temperatures from -40 degrees Celsius outside to a cozy 0 degrees Celsius or more inside. Doesn't sound impressive. Tell that to a seal hunter thawing his eyelashes. The structure itself was alive. It breathed. The ice walls absorbed moisture, refroze it, and slowly created a shell so airtight it trapped not just air, but life. And this was no accident. Across Arctic cultures, architecture was built around respiration. The entrance tunnel of an igloo curved down before rising into the main chamber, forcing warm air to pool where people slept. Fire, if used at all, was modest. The real heat came from breath, bodies, and seal oil lamps exhaling in sync. Anthropologists who've spent nights in these snow sanctuaries report the same uncanny thing. It's not just warm, it's alive. The walls glisten, the air hums faintly with moisture, and the snow breathes back at you. Elsewhere, the same principle appeared in earth lodges, pit houses, and even caves. Warm air is lazy. It wants to rise, so people learned to shape the ground and ceilings to coax it into staying. Neolithic dwellings in Siberia and the Eurasian steppe show careful control of airflow, small vents for smoke, narrow passages for entry, thick mounds of soil that trapped each exhalation like a secret. The body became part of the architecture, the lungs a furnace for the home. Breath wasn't just biology, it was culture. Many languages still equate breath with spirit. The connection wasn't philosophical, it was practical. The moment a human stopped breathing, the warmth drained from the body. Breath was the soul made visible, a ghost of heat that left when life did. No wonder it became sacred. In Arctic rituals, the shared air inside a snow house was thought to mingle the spirits of the living and the ancestors. Everyone inhaling the same air, recycled through generations, warmed by memory. It's oddly poetic, the thought that survival depended on something so fragile. Fire could fail, walls could crack, but breath, that soft, rhythmic pulse of heat, was constant. The entire Ice Age world became a slow respiration, humans breathing into the earth exhaling through them. And yet, for all its intimacy, breath had limits. It could heat the space, but it couldn't hold it. The next great discovery was solidity, that Earth itself could be shaped to hug warmth, tighter, thicker, longer. Once people learned to trap breath inside soil, architecture and warmth finally became the same thing. At some point, people stopped treating the ground like an inconvenience and started realizing it was the best blanket on the planet. Soil, for all its unglamorous charm, is an excellent insulator. It absorbs heat, sulks about it, and refuses to let it go. While ice and wind competed for dominance above, humans discovered that warmth could survive underground, not in defiance of nature, but by surrendering to it. Archaeologists have uncovered this quiet genius everywhere. In Ukraine, mammoth bone dwellings from 15,000 years ago used curved tusks as the framework for roofs covered in hides and packed with soil. These weren't huts, they were thermal batteries disguised as houses. The bones gave structure, the hides blocked wind, and the earth sealed in the breath of the living. Step inside one, and the temperature difference could mean the difference between endurance and extinction. Humans had learned to weaponize dirt. Fast forward to Iceland's turf houses, built millennia later on the same principle. Compacted earth layered with grass, trapping both air and moisture like a natural thermostat. The Siberian Uranga, the Arctic pit house, the North American earth lodge, all born of the same intuition. Warmth doesn't come from flame, it comes from resistance. If the cold wants to enter, make it climb through a wall of frozen mud and stubbornness. It's almost poetic how much early architecture mimicked the body itself. Walls like skin, roofs like scalp, fire like the heartbeat. The structures even breathed. Vents and smoke holes acted like nostrils, managing airflow and condensation. Some homes had layered walls, sod, clay, fur, straw, the architectural equivalent of dressing for the weather. The layering wasn't aesthetic, it was mathematical, long before math existed. Heat loss was geometry in disguise. And let's not forget the shape: round, oval, curved, circles, domes, mounds. The human preference for roundhouses wasn't superstition, it was thermodynamics. Corners trap cold air and invite drafts. A circle keeps warmth circulating, hugging it like an embrace. Even the layout of ancient hearths and sleeping platforms followed this logic. Everyone facing inward, bodies reflecting heat toward a shared center. Warmth as community design. Of course, life inside these spaces wasn't exactly glamorous. The air was thick, the smoke constant, the ceiling low enough to make a tall man philosophical. But comfort wasn't the point, continuity was. To wake up with frost on your eyelashes, but breath still fogging the air, that was proof the system worked. And beneath all that practicality was something quietly spiritual, the merging of human and earth. The house wasn't separate from the landscape. It was the landscape, rearranged. When a family built a pit house, they weren't escaping nature, they were burrowing into it, asking the planet to share its warmth. And in return, they gave it breath, light, and story. But there was one element still missing, the small golden center around which all this engineering revolved, the heart of heat itself. Because for all the warmth borrowed from skin, breath, and earth, nothing united them like the flicker of firelight. Fire wasn't just a discovery, it was an audition for godhood. The first time someone dragged a burning branch into a cave, the Ice Age ended early for that one small spot. In a world ruled by darkness, fire was sunlight, on demand, arrogant, defiant, miraculous. The hearth became the center of everything: warmth, food, protection, gossip, myth. Humanity's first sun, domesticated and slightly smoky. You can almost imagine the scene. A small flame crackling inside a ring of stones, painting walls with trembling gold. Around it, people thawing fingers, cooking meat, whispering stories about the last time someone tried to keep a fire alive through a snowstorm and failed spectacularly. The hearth was both miracle and menace. Let it die, and you might as well lie down with the mammoths. Let it grow, and your roof became a cautionary tale about ventilation. The invention of controlled fire, somewhere between 1 and 2 million years ago, perfected by Homo erectus long before speech, was the original technological revolution. Archaeological sites like Gesher, Benot, Yakov in Israel and Jalkudin in China still show the fingerprints of this mastery. Ash deposits, reddened stone, charred bone. Fire didn't just warm, it organized. It dictated where people gathered, where they slept, where they prayed. Warmth had finally found a focal point. As civilization evolved, so did fire's manners. No longer wild, it learned ritual. The hearth was elevated. Literally, Egyptian homes placed it in raised pits to protect against drafts. The Greeks made it sacred, dedicating it to Hestia. The Romans called it focus, the root of our modern word, as if they knew warmth and attention were the same thing. Everywhere, the pattern repeated. The center of the house was a small sun that refused to set. But the genius wasn't just in the flame, it was in what surrounded it. Early people learned to build reflective surfaces, stone, clay, even polished bone to redirect heat inward. They discovered that damp fuel smothered warmth, and that dung burned longer than wood. Every civilization found its own combustion equation. The Inuit used seal fat lamps, the Mongols yak dung, Europeans hardwood. Each fire a fingerprint of its ecology, each flame a confession of geography. And of course, fire changed time itself. Before it, night was final, a full stop. After it, evening became negotiable. Around the hearth, people told stories, planned hunts, debated spirits, and occasionally burned their dinner. It was warmth that extended consciousness, transforming human rhythm from diurnal to eternal. Still, fire wasn't perfect. It devoured oxygen, filled homes with smoke, and encouraged a few disastrous open flame meets fur cloak incidents. But humanity tolerated the risk because fire was more than heat. It was identity. To gather around a hearth was to announce, we're alive, we're here, and we refuse to go quietly into the cold. The hearth was the beating heart of warmth, but every heart needs arteries. And in those dim, smoky shelters, People discovered that warmth could travel in ways even fire couldn't, through smoke, fat, and the strange microclimate of the air itself. Once fire became domesticated, humanity did what it always does with technology. It overused it, misunderstood it, and then accidentally discovered something brilliant. Smoke, for instance, the original complaint of every enclosed shelter. It stung, it choked, it made eyes water and lungs burn. But long before chimneys were invented, people realized that smoke wasn't just the price of warmth, it was warmth in another form. A lazy, drifting insulation that wrapped everything it touched in a faint chemical hug. Inside a hut or snow house, smoke gathered near the roof, forming a hazy ceiling that trapped heat below. It killed insects, cured meat, preserved hides, and sealed cracks in the walls with an oily film that turned porous dwellings into weatherproof cocoons. Anthropologists studying Arctic and plateau tribes found that smoke buildup could raise internal temperatures by several degrees, enough to make the difference between life and hypothermia. So yes, the ancestors were basically slow cooking themselves, but they were warm. Then came the second genius move: fat. Animal fat was fire's best friend and its therapist. Seal oil, bear grease, yak tallow, even marrow, rendered from bone, all burned with a slow, steady flame that outlasted wood and produced less smoke. In the Arctic, the kullik, a shallow stone lamp filled with seal oil and topped with a moss wick, wasn't just a light source, it was the home's soul. It melted snow, dried clothes, cooked food, and kept families from turning into tragic ice sculptures. Archaeologists still find soot from these lamps fused into snow house ceilings, proof that warmth once had a scent, rich, fatty, and faintly divine. Every culture had its own version of the kullik: the Sami's reindeer fat lamps, Siberian clay burners, even early European hearth bowls lined with animal grease. In each, fat was the portable sun, a biochemical storage of summer, released in small, glowing doses during winter. When you lit it, you weren't just burning fuel, you were burning memory. Sunlight metabolized through fur and flesh, and together, smoke and fat created something rare, a microclimate. Step inside a smoke-blackened hut after a snowstorm, and you'd feel it, the air thick, damp, warm, moving slower than outside. The smoke insulated, the fat vaporized moisture, and the human bodies completed the ecosystem. The hut became a miniature planet, its own atmosphere held together by combustion and hope. Sure, it came with side effects. Everything smelled like bacon. The ceilings dripped tar. Coughing was a family tradition. But warmth has never been about comfort. It's always been about compromise. Smoke and fat blurred the lines between cleanliness and survival, creating homes that glowed from within like living lungs. And while the smoke curled upward, human attention shifted downward to the places their bodies actually met the earth. Because even the most perfectly smoked hut couldn't save you from the cold creeping through the floor. The next great experiment in warmth would come not from air or flame, but from the quiet genius of sleeping above the ground. The ground, despite all appearances, has never been your friend. It looks solid, dependable, even maternal, until you lie down on it in winter and it starts stealing your soul through your spine. The ancients figured this out fast. Heat rises, cold sinks, and if you're sleeping directly on the earth, congratulations, you've just volunteered to be the planet's heating pad. Early humans didn't know the laws of thermodynamics, but they understood betrayal when they felt it in their bones. So they started scheming. Archaeological sites from the Paleolithic to the Arctic today reveal the same small act of rebellion. Layers, moss, grass, reeds, hides, anything that could lift the body away from the dirt's greedy chill. The principle was simple but brilliant. Dead air doesn't conduct heat. A few inches of trapped nothingness could save your life. The Nenets of Siberia still line their sleeping platforms with reindeer fur, hollow fibers cradling the warmth of the body. The Inuit did it with caribou hides, their dense underfur acting like a natural mattress. Even Stone Age Europeans used moss and straw stuffed into pits, early prototypes of the modern bed. And then there was the snow itself. In a twist that feels like humanity's ongoing argument with logic, people learned that snow, frozen water, the very symbol of cold, could insulate. In igloos and winter shelters, sleeping platforms made from compacted snow sat above the entryway. Cold air, being denser, sank down toward the door. Warmth, being lazy, stayed up with the people. Thermodynamics became social hierarchy, the sleepers literally on top. The pattern repeats everywhere you look, from the Kel huts of Mongolia to the semi-subterranean pit houses of the Americas. The body was always slightly elevated on stones, logs, or animal skins. Even ancient Egyptian workers, baking instead of freezing, used raised sleeping platforms to escape the ground's nighttime chill. Civilization, it turns out, was built on the world's oldest life hack: don't touch the floor. The science of sleeping warm wasn't just about comfort, it was philosophy and practice. To separate yourself from the ground was to declare independence from nature's indifference. The floor represented death, stillness, absorption, return. The raised bed, even if made of moss and bones, said, "Not yet." And yet the methods weren't purely practical. They were tactile, intimate. The choice of material mattered as much as its availability. In the Arctic, families shared sleeping platforms wide enough for several generations, their breath pooling above them like invisible quilts. In warmer regions, soft reeds were layered with ash or sand to deter insects and absorb moisture, ancient humidity control. Every sleeping surface was a compromise between decay and warmth, cleanliness and survival, gravity and defiance. What's astonishing is how little this logic has changed. Modern mattresses, thermal pads, down blankets, all descendants of those same principles. Lift the body, trap the air, stop the earth from drinking your heat. Humanity's longest relationship is with temperature, and it's never been equal. But even the best bedding couldn't follow you outside. And eventually, you had to leave the safety of the fire and the hides to face the cold itself. So people did the only reasonable thing. They turned their clothes into portable houses, carrying warmth on their backs like walking hearths. At some point, someone got tired of freezing between the house and the fire pit, and decided, quite sensibly, to wear the house. That's all clothing ever was. Architecture with sleeves. Humanity didn't invent fashion, it invented survival on a leash. Furs became walls, seams became beams, and the body turned into the living room. Somewhere in the tundra, a Paleolithic tailor looked at a reindeer and saw both dinner and real estate. The first garments weren't made for beauty or modesty. They were blueprints in flesh and fiber. Archaeologists have found bone needles as thin as modern ones at sites like Kastenki and Jujuana, proving Ice Age people weren't just wrapping hides around themselves, they were engineering microclimates. Every stitch mattered. A gap could mean frostbite. A badly aligned seam could funnel wind like an insult. In a sense, prehistoric people invented both the coat and quality control. The Inuit took this to perfection. Their double-layered caribou parkas fur facing inward on one layer, outward on the other created air pockets that trapped heat so efficiently that explorers centuries later borrowed the design wholesale and pretended it was innovation. Sami herders wore layered reindeer garments designed to move moisture outward before it froze. Even the boots were works of physics, sealskin on the outside, grass insulation within, flexible enough to walk, yet warm enough to mock the weather. Every thread was strategy, but it wasn't just Arctic genius. Across prehistory, humans turned local ecology into wearable infrastructure. The Innu in Japan used woven tree bark. The Nenets combined fish skin and fur. Steppe peoples lined felt coats with wool and horsehair, a merger of texture and thermodynamics. Even tropical cultures, who didn't exactly fear frostbite, layered fabrics against the chill of night, a universal instinct to trap the breath of the body before it escaped. And as with architecture, design followed physics, not vanity. Curved seams, tapered sleeves, and tight collars weren't aesthetic choices, they were heat containment strategies. Loose clothing, counterintuitively, kept people warmer because it allowed a pocket of air to linger between skin and hide. The cold could press all it wanted, but there was always that small, invisible space saying, "Not today." Of course, comfort was a luxury concept. The smell of seal oil, the perpetual dampness, the itch of smoke-stiffened fur warmth had a price, and it was paid in personal hygiene. Ancient parkas were rarely washed. They were scraped, smoked, and occasionally fed new fat to stay waterproof. Essentially, your coat was a semi-living organism with worse manners than you. But it worked. Clothing changed everything. It broke geography's grip on the species. Wrapped in fur, grass, or felt, humans could walk into places that logic forbade. Warmth went mobile. Civilization hit the road. And soon, this portable shelter evolved into something even stranger, a philosophy of restraint. Because the more layers you wore, the less you could move, and the cold didn't care about fashion paralysis. Survival, once again, required balance. Insulation without suffocation, warmth without sweat. The next lesson would come not from hide or hair, but from the invisible wall between moisture and breath. The delicate art of staying warm and dry when the world insisted on freezing both. If cold was the enemy, sweat was its double agent. It pretended to help, then quietly murdered you in your sleep. Anyone who's ever hiked through snow in a too thick coat knows the betrayal. You start warm, get confident, then suddenly your clothes are wetter than a tragic metaphor. The Arctic didn't forgive that sort of optimism. The rule was simple: never sweat in the cold. Or as one Inuit proverb roughly translates, only fools and seals enjoy being damp. Moisture was the great saboteur of warmth. Water conducts heat away 25 times faster than air. So one bad sprint, one overzealous hunt, and all that precious insulation turned into a refrigerated towel. Early Arctic travelers learned this, the hard way: whole expeditions undone by enthusiasm. The ancestors didn't have thermometers, but they had intuition, and intuition said, slow down, dry fast, and never trust your armpits. So breath and movement became a kind of temperature diplomacy. Hunters learned to breathe through fur masks or mittens, recycling humidity and trapping warmth near the face. The Sami wrapped scarves of reindeer wool around the mouth to warm incoming air, turning every exhale into a miniature weather system. Inuit parkas had built-in hoods that created a pocket of warm breath around the head. Your lungs became your heating ducts. It was an elegant solution. Keep the air warm before it even reaches the heart. The science of dryness became ritual. Travelers packed spare moss to stuff into boots when the first layer grew damp organic socks, avant la lettre. Grass liners were replaced daily. Seal oil rubbed on seams to keep water out. In some regions, people slept with their outer garments inside the bedding to thaw and dry them using body heat. Nightly laundry, powered by metabolism. Imagine a dryer cycle that smells like fish oil and necessity. The line between breathing and living grew thin. Every inhale carried cold. Every exhale pushed it back. To breathe too hard was to lose heat. To breathe too shallow was to suffocate. Survival meant finding that calm rhythm where lungs and landscape negotiated a truce. In this way, breath became architecture, again an internal igloo, self-regulating, self-aware, and yet, even with all this mastery of moisture and air, humans still sought a kind of permanence. Breath evaporated, fires died, clothes wore out, but earth patient, immovable, earth offered something better, a warmth that didn't flicker. The next evolution in staying alive would come from building deeper, thicker, closer to the planet's own pulse. When people began to bury themselves partly in soil, they weren't giving up. They were, quite literally, learning how to live inside warmth itself. If heaven refused to send enough sunlight, humans did the only reasonable thing. They moved in with the planet. There's a certain humility to the first people who decided that the ground, forever cold on the surface, might be warmer underneath. You could call it engineering, or just desperation with a shovel. Either way, they discovered something astonishing. Beneath a few feet of frost and dirt, the Earth keeps a steady temperature, constant, indifferent, quietly generous, the perfect roommate. Across the Arctic and subarctic, this revelation birthed a new kind of dwelling, the semi-subterranean house. You can still trace its logic from Alaska's ancient pit houses to the Siberian Uranga, and even to Bronze Age Europe's earth lodges. Each was a modest miracle of physics, a pit dug into permafrost, walls lined with wood or bone, roofed with sod, moss, and snow. The entrance dropped lower than the living chamber, forcing cold air to settle harmlessly by the door. Inside, heat gathered and stayed, like a rumor that refused to die. The technique worked because Earth has thermal inertia. It changes temperature slowly, holding daytime warmth through the night, buffering against the tantrums of the weather above. Archaeologists studying these structures found that even in regions where the outside temperature hit -40 degrees Celsius, the interiors hovered near freezing, practically tropical by Ice Age standards. Add a lamp, a few breathing humans, and some seal fat smoke, and you had a functioning climate zone of your own invention. The architecture wasn't just practical, it was poetic. These homes were literal extensions of the body, ribs of timber, lungs of smoke, skin of sod. They merged with the landscape so completely that from a distance you couldn't tell where humanity ended and the hill began. To enter one was to return to the womb, dim, warm, muffled, safe. The hearth glowed faintly in the middle, the only heartbeat visible. It wasn't only the cold who taught this lesson. In Iceland, turf houses followed the same logic, layering soil and grass thick enough to muffle even the sound of storms. On the steppes, Mongol nomads half-buried their yurts during winter to steal the ground's warmth. Even in prehistoric France, the famed Les Isis caves were retrofitted with stone walls to trap geothermal comfort. Every climate eventually turned inward. The earth became both shelter and symbol, and it changed how people thought. If the heavens were unpredictable and cruel, the soil was steady, ancient, and merciful. Warmth, once associated with the sun, was now found in darkness. To live underground wasn't to retreat, it was to trust. The planet became partner rather than adversary, and the concept of home evolved from surface to depth. But even buried warmth wasn't a solo affair. A pit house could retain heat, but it took bodies to ignite it, breath to sustain it, and proximity to make it bearable. Warmth, at every level, was a collective act, and that realization that the body itself was part of the architecture led to something far more complex than engineering, the social choreography of heat. If warmth began as survival, it quickly evolved into politics. In the old houses of earth and hide, heat wasn't democratic, it was distributed. Who slept closest to the fire said everything about who mattered. The elders, the infants, the sick, they got the central spots, where smoke curled gently and frost melted from the air. Hunters and adolescents slept further out, wrapped in their pride and their inadequate fur. Even comfort, it seemed, obeyed hierarchy. Across the Arctic and steppe, warmth arranged people the way power arranges cities concentrically. The center was life, light, and control. The periphery, colder, darker, was where you learned humility. Anthropologists studying Siberian Chukchi dwellings or Sami tents described the same geometry, circular structures with sleeping platforms radiating around a single hearth. The shape wasn't aesthetic, it was thermal social order. Heat flowed like authority, and everyone knew their distance from it. But it wasn't just about privilege, it was about obligation. To share warmth was to affirm kinship. In Arctic families, the morning ritual began with the unspoken question, who needs the heat most today? Infants were carried in fur-lined pouches pressed against a mother's chest, sharing her breath rhythm by rhythm. Elders were positioned nearest the lamp, so that their fading bodies would waste less energy fighting the cold. Every inch of proximity was an ethical decision, and the strange thing is, the system worked. Thermal cooperation became emotional cooperation. Survival required harmony, or at least the performance of it. You couldn't afford grudges in a house where your breath literally kept others alive. Warmth forced civility, a kind of thermal diplomacy. You learned to control your temper because slamming out of the hut in anger meant freezing to death before you reached the door. In many languages, the words for hearth and family overlap. Among the Nenets, the same term can mean both home and fireplace. Among the Inuit, a woman's lamp was synonymous with her household. Warmth wasn't a metaphor for belonging, it was belonging. Every breath that condensed in the shared air was a reminder that the group existed or perished together. Individualism, that modern frostbite of the soul, had no place there. Of course, there was passive aggression even in paradise. Someone always snored too loudly. Someone always hogged the hides. There were rules for that, 2 punishments calibrated with dark humor. A Nenets proverb warned that a man who spread his legs too far near the fire would heed the gods instead. Translation: move over. Still, this collective warmth created more than comfort. It built empathy. To touch another person for survival blurred every social boundary between gender, age, even species. Dogs slept against human feet, infants against grandmothers, everyone equalized by temperature. You didn't need language to feel connection, you just needed shared breath. And as heat became social glue, it also became spiritual metaphor. People began to think of warmth as something more than physical, a presence, a favor, a sign of balance between the living and the unseen. The body, the fire, the gods, all radiated from the same unseen source. Eventually, warmth stopped being just a comfort and started being a moral condition. It wasn't enough to be warm, one had to deserve it. The fire in the hearth became a mirror of the fire in the soul. and every civilization from the tundra to the tropics decided, in its own poetic way, that temperature and virtue were somehow related. The cold wasn't merely inconvenient anymore, it was symbolic. To be cold was to be estranged from others, from the gods, from life itself. Among Arctic shamans, warmth was proof of favor. Their rituals, often performed half-naked in frozen air, weren't tests of endurance so much as demonstrations of harmony. If the spirits liked you, the fire inside you burned strong enough to ignore the blizzard. The Ewenki called this sakin, inner heat part breath, part soul, part sheer refusal to die. Monks in the Himalayas still practice tumo, a meditation that raises body temperature enough to dry wet sheets in sub-zero weather. Science calls it thermogenesis. Tradition calls it enlightenment. Either way, it's proof that the line between physics and faith is thinner than a layer of reindeer fur. In animistic cosmologies, warmth wasn't human property, it circulated. Fire was borrowed from the gods, just as breath was borrowed from ancestors. When an Inuit family lit their seal oil lamp, the kullik, it wasn't merely for light, it was an invocation. The flame represented the life of the household, and the woman tending it was the keeper of existence itself. Let it die, and misfortune seeped in like frost. Let it thrive, and the spirit stayed content, at least until the next storm. This logic burned everywhere. In Europe's long winters, the hearth was the altar. In Japan, the Aurori sunken hearth became a symbol of the family's unity and karma. Warmth had moral temperature. Too much fire meant hubris, too little meant neglect. Myths reflected the same thermodynamics. Prometheus punished for bringing heat to humans, Loki bound for misusing it, the Aztec sun demanding sacrifice to keep his warmth steady. Across the world, people intuited the same cruel truth. Fire wasn't ours, it tolerated us. Even speech carried the metaphor: warm-hearted, cold-blooded, fiery spirit. The vocabulary of temperature became the vocabulary of character. Warmth meant kindness, generosity, life. Cold meant withdrawal, cruelty, death. To warm someone was to feed their spirit. To leave them cold was to banish them. The emotional climate literally was the climate. And in that strange symmetry, the universe seemed to whisper that heat was the signature of being alive. Every exhale, every glowing ember, every body pressed close in the dark was a defiance of entropy. The ancients didn't need physics to understand that energy equals existence. They felt it in their bones each winter night. Warmth wasn't luxury, it was proof. But even proof fades. Fires die, bodies cool. And as centuries passed, the memory of these intimate alliances with fur, breath, and earth began to vanish beneath central heating and sealed windows. Yet something of it remained, buried in architecture, in language, in the quiet nostalgia humans feel for the flicker of an open flame. That lingering trace of ancient ingenuity is where the story of warmth ends, not as a victory, but as an inheritance. What remains after warmth leaves isn't cold, it's memory. Somewhere between the glow of firelight and the hum of a radiator, humanity forgot that heat used to be handmade. We inherited comfort but misplaced the order. Once, every ember had a lineage, every breath carried responsibility. Now, warmth arrives with a switch, instant, invisible, and sterile. No smoke, no labor, no community, just temperature. Archaeologists can still trace the old reverence in what the dead took with them. Burials from the Upper Paleolithic show bodies wrapped in fur, cradled in red ochre, symbolic sunlight for the journey below. Some Arctic graves were lined with moss and feathers, as if the living wanted to remind the earth how to be kind. Warmth, in death, was an act of defiance. We'll stay human even in the dark. And in that red dust and layered hide lies the emotional fossil of an idea, that to be cared for is to be kept warm. Even the houses remember. The sod dwellings in Iceland, the stone igloos in Canada, the turf lodges of the Sami, their ruins are still slightly warmer inside than the air outside. Archaeologists stepping into them describe a strange sensation. The air feels heavy, used, familiar, as if generations of breath have lingered in the soil, refusing to leave. You can almost feel the ghosts exhaling, keeping the old pact alive. We shared warmth once, we can do it again. And the technologies of the past never fully vanished. The architecture of insulation, the physics of layering, the communal logic of heat, all of it survives in modern homes. Our walls are thicker, our heaters smaller, but the pattern's the same. Trap the air, soften the edges, and keep the world's indifference outside. Even the word hearth hides inside heart. Language remembers what industry forgets. Yet there's irony in how much we've insulated ourselves. Central heating may have solved the cold, but it also killed the ritual. No one huddles for survival anymore. We sit apart, each glowing rectangle of comfort, calibrated to personal preference. The warmth is precise but lonely. We've perfected temperature and lost temperature's meaning. Still, when the power fails or winter outstays its welcome, something ancient wakes up. We light candles, gather blankets, press closer. For a brief moment, we remember what every mammoth hunter and snow sleeper once knew, that warmth is fragile, and it's best shared. The fire, even when electric, is still our heartbeat. The air that fogs the window is still our breath. The walls that hold it are still made from the earth's patient body. And beneath all our modern insulation, a quiet truth hums, that warmth was never really invented. It was always there, waiting to be noticed, built, traded, worshipped. A truce between flesh and frost, between sky and soil, and in that truce lies everything that made humanity possible. Fur, breath, earth, and the stubborn belief that even in the coldest night, something will keep us alive. Comfort, as it turns out, was never the point of sleep. That came later after industry, after luxury, after marketing departments learned to sell rest the same way they sell perfume. For most of human history, people lay down not on pillows but on the planet itself. Hard soil, woven reeds, animal skins, still carrying the ghost of warmth. It was simple, yes, but not crude. The ground wasn't the enemy. It was alignment, contact, and humility all at once. Beds, in contrast, are declarations. They sit above the floor like thrones, pretending that gravity doesn't apply to their owners. But nature doesn't negotiate with posture. The spine evolved for walking on dirt and resting on it, not for being swallowed by foam or suspended on springs. In fact, the very idea of softness as comfort is a late invention. For thousands of years, a bed was nothing more than a clean patch of earth near the fire, occasionally upgraded with straw if one was feeling extravagant. The irony is that this closeness to the ground wasn't poverty, it was design. A body spread evenly against the earth doesn't sag or twist, it breathes. Archaeological sites in Africa show the earliest bedding layers made from sedge-grass and leaves, dating back at least 77,000 years, carefully arranged to repel insects. Those were our first mattresses, built not for indulgence but for survival. And still, people woke up without neck pain. Somewhere between civilization and advertising, rest became something to be bought. The ground, once trusted, became dirty. Elevation began to mean refinement. Wood frames lifted sleepers higher, not for anatomy, but for appearance. The higher you slept, the richer you were, literally above others, even while unconscious. Kings slept on stacked cushions, nobles on carved platforms, servants on floors. Sleep became a hierarchy. But the human body, that old animal, never got the memo. Modern orthopedic studies keep rediscovering what prehistory already knew. Firm, flat surfaces support the spine's natural curvature. Soft ones sabotage it. In clinical tests from Japan to Ethiopia, populations that sleep close to the ground report fewer chronic back issues than those who spend 8 hours each night sinking into engineered softness. So the great irony of the modern bed is that it's built against biology. The more we chase comfort, the more restless we become. Sleep technology keeps inflating like an air mattress in a windstorm. Adjustable frames, cooling gels, memory foam that remembers too much, and yet people are exhausted. Perhaps what's missing isn't more comfort, but less of it. Because comfort, as anthropology keeps whispering, was never about plushness. It was about safety, and safety once meant being low, grounded, surrounded by others, near the warmth of fire and the steady pulse of the earth itself. And maybe that's where the story bends next, to the spine that learned to rest, not on cushions, but on clay. The spine is a stubborn creature. It remembers things we'd rather forget, like how to walk barefoot on uneven ground, or how to curl naturally against the earth without a single orthopedic guideline. It was never meant to recline on spring coils or vanish into 2 feet of foam. Those came much later, along with other human inventions that quietly punish the body for being human. Anatomically speaking, the human spine is a miracle of engineering and a terrible candidate for the modern bed. It curves like a question mark because it evolved to distribute pressure across solid surfaces. When you lie on something firm, the vertebrae align, muscles release, and the body stabilizes itself like a bridge built on stone. When you lie on a soft mattress, however, the structure collapses inward, the spine sags, the joints protest, the muscles brace through the night as if holding a silent vigil for lost evolution. Anthropologists studying traditional societies noticed something striking. In communities where people sleep on mats, skins, or bare floors, chronic back pain is nearly absent. Not reduced, absent. Japanese futons, woven mats in Ethiopia, palm leaves in Madagascar, all flat, all firm. Yet the posture of those who use them would make a yoga instructor weep with envy. No one needed a chiropractor. Their bones already knew what to do. It's not nostalgia speaking, it's physiology. When the body rests against the ground, pressure is distributed evenly. Blood flow improves. Muscles relax naturally. The skeletal system does what millions of years of adaptation taught it to: work with gravity, not against it. Ironically, by lifting ourselves off the earth, we created the very ailments we then invented medicine to treat. There's a kind of quiet poetry in that. The creature that rose upright, then spent the rest of its history trying to lie down correctly. And perhaps it isn't just the spine that forgot its roots, because what rested on that earth wasn't only the body, but the heat, the breath, and the rhythm that tethered humans to something older. Before there were walls or bedrooms or pillows, there was the simple contact between skin and soil, a kind of dialogue between flesh and planet. And in that conversation lay more than posture. It was temperature, scent, sound, the body's subtle choreography with the environment. So perhaps to understand how the spine learned to rest, one must understand what it rested upon. The ground itself, the first and most forgiving mattress of all. And that leads us, inevitably, to what the earth offered in return: balance, warmth, and a way of keeping the body alive through the long, cold, dark. There's something strangely intimate about lying on the ground. Not symbolically, literally. The body sinks into the planet's quiet pulse, heat passing in both directions, like an unspoken truce. In the dark, before walls or clocks, this was how humanity negotiated comfort, by sharing temperature with the earth itself. Every ancient dwelling, from huts in the African savanna to pit houses in Siberia, carried that same architectural logic. The ground was the bed. The soil wasn't just beneath people, it was part of the design. A thin layer of grass or woven fiber softened the contact, but what truly mattered was stability. The earth stayed cool when days burned and warm when nights froze. It breathed in a way that bricks and mattresses never do. Modern physiology has a term for it: thermoregulation, but early humans didn't need a word. They learned it through skin. In desert heat, the body pressed close to the ground's cooler layers. In winter, proximity to embers kept the blood moving. Archaeological remains show beds lined with ash beneath the grass, a clever trick that repelled insects and trapped warmth. In the Kalahari, people still sleep on sand hollows molded perfectly to their bodies, their warmth feeding back into the surface through the night. It's an unspoken collaboration between flesh and soil. Even the faint vibrations of the ground, rain, wind, footsteps, were signals, not disturbances. A sleeper could feel approaching animals long before hearing them. To lie on the ground wasn't passive. It was alert rest, the kind that trusts the earth to whisper warnings. There's another layer to this, one that modern wellness culture tries to borrow awkwardly under. Names like earthing or grounding. But this was never mystical. It was practical, the body discharging static through sweat and soil, the nervous system syncing to environmental rhythms. Electricians later proved what shamans already suspected. The earth absorbs excess charge. Humans, being conductive, were part of that system long before anyone called it healing. And perhaps that's why sleeping close to the ground always carried a strange calm, the kind that doesn't feel invented. People weren't resting on the earth. They were resting with it, a different civilization quietly forgot. Because once the body began to rise onto cots, onto frames, onto privilege, something else fell away. The closeness, the shared breath, the nightly choreography of bodies side by side in the flicker of firelight. And that closeness, both thermal and human, is where the story turns next, to the floor, not as furniture, but as the stage where community itself once slept, dreamed, and survived together. The floor was never just a surface, it was a gathering. Before beds divided people into layers of privacy, sleep was communal, a nightly migration back toward warmth and breath. Families, hunters, newborns, and elders all folded into the same circle, bodies touching, dreams overlapping like the furs that covered them. In that soft tangle of limbs and murmurs, the human sense of safety was invented. Anthropologists who lived among nomadic or forest-dwelling groups often described this closeness as practical intimacy. It wasn't sentiment, it was survival. Warmth was shared like language. If one person turned, the entire circle adjusted an unconscious rhythm, a choreography older than music. Children learned the cadence of adult breathing before they ever learned to speak. The floor wasn't just for sleeping. It was a quiet parliament where heartbeat, fire crackle, and whisper formed the night's dialogue. Fire was the anchor, always. At its edge, the night glowed, just enough to separate life from the waiting dark. Those closest to the embers slept in light, those at the periphery in shadow, and between them existed the oldest social order in the world. The brave or foolish took the outer edge, where predators tested the scent of smoke. The elders, those repositories of stories and silence, usually lay near the center, half dozing. Even when architecture appeared, huts, tents, longhouses, the habit remained. Floors of packed clay or woven reeds were wide, shared, and democratic. There was no headboard, no side of the bed, no walls between sleepers. And that proximity bred something subtle but crucial: empathy. When you spend every night hearing another person breathe, fear changes shape. It becomes collective, and in a strange way, manageable. The psychological effect of communal sleeping still shows up in studies today. Infants who sleep near their parents regulate their breathing faster. Adults in crowded disaster shelters fall asleep sooner despite the noise. The body recognizes company as safety, even when the mind calls it inconvenience. Modernity, in its quest for privacy, mistook solitude for rest, forgetting that humans were designed to fall asleep surrounded by warmth and faint conversation. But intimacy always had a cost. The closer you slept to others, the more you surrendered to their rhythms, their snores, their coughs, their movements. Over centuries, as hierarchies rose, some decided they deserved quieter dreams. And from that quiet, the bed was born, raised, cordoned, draped in curtains to separate one sleeper from the rest. Comfort, once shared, became personal. And yet, by lifting the body off the ground, something else lifted too: the invisible bridge between warmth, vigilance, and belonging. That separation would change everything, from how people organized space to how they defined dignity itself. Because the moment sleep became an individual luxury, the body became property. And from there, it wasn't long before beds turned into symbols of class, faith, and power. Sleep has never been a gentle thing. In the beginning, it was an act of trust as small, nightly surrender in a world that didn't care whether you woke up again. The ground was never empty. It pulsed with insects, whispered with snakes, and kept the sound of soft feet in the dark. Yet people still lay down. They just learned to do it wisely. To sleep close to the fire wasn't laziness, it was strategy. Every ember was a shield. The smoke masked the scent of flesh. The flicker frightened the eyes that gleamed in the underbrush. In many ancient shelters, burn marks around the sleeping circle reveal how the hearth wasn't placed in the center of the room, but slightly forward, toward the opening. It was both heater and sentry. Ash spread beneath mats or hides helped drive away parasites. Charred earth was sterile before anyone knew what bacteria meant. Predators determined architecture as much as weather did. Caves, for example, were rarely used deep inside. People slept near the entrance, where the smoke could drift outward and vision could stay open to movement. In open plains, fires were arranged in rings, a pattern repeated across continents long before one group could have learned it from another. Anthropologists who studied the Hadza of Tanzania or the Juhonsi in the Kalahari found the same rhythm fires forming invisible walls around sleeping families, warmth flowing inward, vigilance radiating outward. To be low to the ground was not vulnerability but speed. If danger came, the body could rise in an instant. Beds, with their elevation and soft entrapment, were luxuries of safety objects that appeared only once predators stopped being nightly visitors. A raised sleeper was a confident sleeper, one whose threats had been outsourced to walls, dogs, or servants. In other words, the first bed frame was less a comfort than a declaration: I'm no longer prey. Still, traces of that older fear linger. In most cultures, the position of the bed even now reflects ancient instincts. People angle their heads toward walls, their feet toward exits. No one likes to sleep with their back to a door. Hotels spend fortunes on design, yet guests still prefer the corner room with a view of the entrance. Evolution doesn't care about interior decor. It remembers what it was like to survive the night. Even the smoke itself played a role beyond safety. It perfumed the hair, dried the skin, and gave scent to the air that meant home. Children growing up near the hearth carried that smell in their hair as proof of belonging. And perhaps, more than warmth or protection, that was the true function of the night fire, a shared odor of safety. When firelight flickered across sleeping faces, the earth glowed red beneath them, ash, sweat, and breath merging into one warm organism. In that dim communion, humanity learned to trust the dark just enough to dream. And from that trust came creativity, ritual, and eventually, invention, the urge to improve the surface that held the body. Because even in survival, vanity found a foothold. People began layering leaves, stretching hides, and weaving reeds into comfort. Primitive bedding, yes, but also the first sign that rest could become art, and that's where the ground began to change. From necessity to craft, from earth to design. The first beds weren't meant to pamper anyone. They were more like experiments in negotiation, a way to make peace between the skin and the soil. Archaeologists in South Africa once uncovered layers of compacted grass and leaves dating back nearly 80 millennia. It wasn't random. Someone had selected sedge and rushes rich in insect-repelling oils, laid them down neatly, and replaced them when they turned brittle. The first mattress, if one insists on calling it that, was a patch of clever botany. Elsewhere, people tuned the recipe to their landscape. In the Arctic, the ground was softened with moss and draped in animal hides that still smelled faintly of smoke. In tropical forests, palm leaves were plaited into mats, springy and aromatic. On the Eurasian steppe, straw stuffed inside cloth sacks became insulation against the frozen floor. None of these were luxury items. They were the result of generations perfecting the line between comfort and practicality. A mat had to be soft enough to let the bones rest, yet firm enough to keep the spine's quiet architecture intact. Even the act of making a sleeping surface was communal. Women wove fibers together in rhythmic patterns, their fingers following ancestral logic. Children fetched fresh grass. Men smoked hides to soften them. In a sense, bedding was an early form of technology that required cooperation and rhythm. The repetitive motion of weaving or braiding mirrored the pulse of daily life, as if comfort could be woven into existence the same way baskets or nets were. Each region developed its signature texture. The Japanese tatami, for instance, compressed straw so precisely it could last decades without losing shape. In ancient Egypt, woven reeds offered a cool, fragrant bed above the baking floor. Across sub-Saharan Africa, pliant mats rolled up easily for travel, an ingenious combination of portability and hygiene. What they all shared was a refusal to detach the body from nature. The materials came from the same landscape that provided food, shelter, and fuel. When a mat wore out, it decomposed quietly, the earth reclaiming its loan. Compare that to modern beds, whose synthetic foams will outlive entire civilizations. Those early sleepers understood transience as part of rest. You lie down, you decay a little, you rise again. Nothing was wasted, even sleep had a cycle. To lie on woven grass was to join the environment's respiration. Over time, though familiarity bred hierarchy, some mats were thicker, some hides rarer. A well-stuffed pallet began to imply status, suggesting someone had more grass, more goats, or more hands to prepare them. The seed of luxury had been planted in the soil itself, and once comfort became a marker of wealth, it was only a matter of time before people decided the earth wasn't enough. The floor would soon rise, would wood intervene, and the humble mat would evolve into furniture. The moment the bed left the floor, it stopped being a tool and became a statement. It was no longer about sleeping, it was about being seen sleeping. Archaeologists tracing the first raised platforms in Egypt and Mesopotamia noticed something peculiar. They appeared not in homes of common laborers, but in palaces and tombs. Wood, labor, and space were expensive. Elevation was a privilege. And so, the bed became an altar of the self. Half furniture, half declaration of superiority over the dirt. In royal chambers, sleeping was a public act, disguised as rest. Pharaohs and kings reclined on carved wood, inlaid with ivory and gold, their beds often designed to echo the hieroglyphic symbol for rebirth. To lie high above the earth was to imitate the sun god, who sank beneath the horizon each night, only to rise again immaculate. Even the linens carried meaning, imported, perfumed, folded in mathematical precision, as if the geometry of purity could hold back decay. The irony, of course, was that their subjects still slept on the same packed soil that once held the gods themselves. In medieval Europe, the ritual of elevation continued, but with heavier curtains. The canopied bed became a fortress of rank and modesty, a wooden cocoon draped in fabric so thick it muffled gossip and smoke alike. The noble sleeper lay in the middle of a room, guarded by tapestries that kept both cold and servants at bay. These beds were heavy, deliberately so, as if their owners feared being dragged back down to earth. They were carved with coats of arms, saints, beasts, and prayers against the kind of nightmares only privilege can afford. Meanwhile, the floor below remained democratic. Servants, guards, and children still slept near the fire, in the warmth of the lower world, where dreams were cheap and communal. Upstairs, beds stood like ships on dry land, beautiful, stationary, absurdly impractical. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Above, symbolic sleep wrapped in brocade. Below, functional sleep wrapped in smoke. Anthropologists sometimes call this shift the verticalization of rest. It's more poetic than it sounds. As societies stratified, so did sleeping positions. To sleep high meant to be safe, pure, chosen to leave behind the messy, breathing organism of the household floor. The bed's height mirrored one's place in the social order, just as towers and thrones did by day. Even religion played along. Monks elevated their palates as gestures of discipline, nobles as gestures of distinction. The common theme was separation from earth, from insects, from people, from mortality. And yet, the higher the bed climbed, the more fragile its symbolism became. For every ruler reclining in silk, there were 100 bodies below, keeping the fires alive that warmed his sleep. Elevation may have offered prestige, but it severed contact with warmth, with scent, with life. It created the illusion that safety could be purchased by height. But distance always breeds new anxieties. The higher the frame, the colder the air, the louder the silence. To feel pure meant to feel alone, and that loneliness soon demanded its own justification. Morality, hygiene, class. The bed would soon become not just a mark of privilege, but of virtue. By the time the Renaissance rolled around, sleeping on the ground wasn't just inconvenient, it was indecent. The earth had been demoted from cradle to contagion. Dirt, once synonymous with life and fertility, was now accused of harboring invisible evils. The higher one slept, the cleaner one supposedly was, and so began one of humanity's most absurd moral revolutions: purity by elevation. Hygiene became a theology of distance. Aristocrats slept on towering frames, not only to escape rats and drafts, but to demonstrate a sort of moral altitude. To lie close to the ground was to flirt with the same realm as beggars, animals, and sin itself. Beds grew legs like furniture, trying to climb out of shame. Curtains, canopies, and embroidered quilts turned sleep into ceremony. Every layer, mattress, sheet, blanket, was another social wall between flesh and earth. Below these wooden sanctuaries, servants slept where warmth still lived, near kitchens, on pallets, on the hard floor beside their work. Their rest smelled of smoke, yeast, and humanity, all the things the upper rooms tried to erase with lavender, water, and incense. But in that lower world, people still dreamed collectively. They shared body heat, exchanged whispers, and woke with the dawn already on their faces. Upstairs, dreams became private property. The body itself turned into an investment, something to be preserved, perfumed, and presented. It's telling that the vocabulary of status remains vertical even now. We look down on others. We rise in society. We sleep up in lofts and sink down into poverty. Even in architecture, floors became metaphors for worth, ground floors for labor, upper floors for leisure. What began as practical survival, avoiding snakes or damp soil, hardened into ideology. To rest close to the earth became a symptom of inferiority, a moral failing disguised as hygiene. Yet the paradox was inescapable. The poor who slept on straw were often healthier than the elites, choking on perfumes and stagnant air behind velvet drapes. The same air that kept noble lungs pure also trapped smoke, bacteria, and the occasional bedbug colony of aristocratic refinement. And while the poor were mocked for lying in dirt, they at least remained in contact with reality. The same ground that still knew how to regulate temperature, circulate air, and cradle the human spine correctly. But civilization is stubborn when it comes to self-deception. As cities grew denser and diseases spread faster, people doubled down on their faith in distance. Wooden floors thickened, then came carpets, then came entire rooms devoted to sleep as spectacle. The floor became symbolic of everything to be escaped: filth, labor, mortality. And yet, the further humanity climbed from the ground, the sicker it seemed to become, in body and in mind. Sooner or later, the same society that built its beds like towers would look back down and wonder why rest felt worse. And in that irony, science would step in, not to rediscover spirituality, but to correct posture, because the body, unbothered by class or theology, kept insisting on the same truth evolution had written into its bones. The earth was never dirty. It was alignment. It took thousands of years, a few revolutions, and an entire furniture industry before science finally realized the flaw had been right all along. Somewhere in the late 20th century, after decades of marketing slogans promising cloud-like sleep, researchers began to notice a quiet rebellion. Populations in Japan, India, and Africa, those still sleeping on firm mats or woven reeds, reported almost no chronic back pain. Meanwhile, in industrialized nations, entire medical fields were emerging just to fix the spine. And so, in a moment of collective irony, the modern world began funding studies to rediscover what barefoot ancestors already knew. The human body prefers honesty. Lie on a firm surface, and the spine straightens. The muscles release, circulation improves. Lie on something too soft, and the body collapses inward, like a tent losing its poles. Posture, fatigue, digestion, even mood, all quietly tied to the angle between bones and gravity. It's poetic, really, that after inventing skyscrapers, space travel, and synthetic memory foam, humanity's greatest ergonomic revelation was, try the floor. Orthopedists now call it neutral alignment. Yogis call it grounding. But two Paleolithic families in the Rift Valley, it was just sleep. They didn't need charts or posture. Diagrams. Their bedding was made of the same reeds their ancestors had walked on for millennia. The rediscovery came with its own comedy. Wellness culture turned it into a trend. Minimalist sleep, floor therapy, posture camps. There were guides on how to relearn lying down. Luxury brands began selling $800 floor mats, made of linen and recycled foam, proof that civilization can commercialize even humility. And yet, buried beneath all the rebranding, a truth quietly hummed. Our bodies had been waiting for this reunion. In Japan, where futons never went out of style, people simply folded their bedding each morning and reclaimed their space for living. No bed frames, no clutter, no spinal complaints. Elderly Okinawans, some of the longest living humans on Earth, still kneel, sit and sleep on the ground, keeping their joints supple and their posture dignified. In Ethiopia, the Sidama people still use layered grass beds, springy, aromatic, self-renewing. They don't call it minimalism, it's just sensible design. Meanwhile, in the West, the bedroom remains a monument to over-engineering, adjustable bases with remote controls, cooling gels to fix heat trapped by synthetic foams, mattresses that remember your body, though most people would rather forget what they paid for them. And through all this noise, science keeps quietly whispering the same verdict. Evolution never asked for this. So, humanity completes its slow, ironic circle, from soil to silk to science, and ends up right where it began, on the ground. But this time, not out of necessity, out of wisdom. And what a strange evolution it is that progress looks, in the end, like humility rediscovered. Still, even science has its limits. It can measure alignment and REM cycles, but not the deeper quiet that comes from lying against the earth, the kind of calm that predates civilization itself. To find that, one must look not at data, but but at memory. The body remembers, even when the mind forgets. And perhaps, in that memory, lies the final reason people keep returning to the floor. Not for comfort, but for contact. And contact, after all, is where this story ends, or rather, returns to the most human truth of all, that rest was never meant to lift us away from the earth, but to fold us back into it. Eventually, everything returns to the ground. The living, the tired, the proud, all of them find their way down again. Sleeping close to the earth was never just a matter of posture or temperature. It was rehearsal. Each night was a small death, a quiet surrender into the same soil that would one day receive the body entirely. Early people knew this instinctively. They didn't separate sleep from existence. They lay down where they hunted, where they wept, where they were born. The ground was continuity, not dirt. There's something almost ceremonial in the act. A thin mat, a folded hide, the slow exhale as the spine touches what feels like permanence, the smell of dust and ash, the hum of distant insects, all of it reminding the body that it belongs here, not on a pedestal. Civilization tried to build altitude between flesh and soil, but gravity has infinite patience. Every night, it calls the body back down, and for a few hours, at least, we listen. In anthropology, there's a quiet fascination with how sleeping habits mirror cosmologies. For many indigenous groups, the earth wasn't beneath them, it was them. To lie on it was to share its breath, to absorb its cool indifference and its warmth in turn. Even today, old shamans and nomads speak of the ground as a being that listens, not metaphorically, but as a physiological truth. Heartbeats slow, cortisol drops, brainwaves align with the planet's low electromagnetic rhythm. The earth hums, the body hums back. Modern science, clumsy as always, gave this communion a name, grounding, a strange word for something so obvious. It measures voltage where ancestors found reverence, but even in the lab, the results are oddly poetic. Lowered inflammation, steadier heart rate, deeper sleep. The planet is, in a literal sense, a healer, an electrical sink for all our static. And humans, despite the noise of progress, remain its most forgetful patients. To sleep on the ground is to remember proportion. The horizon stops being decorative. The air smells like something again. The spine relaxes, but so does ambition. There's a humility in feeling the firmness beneath your ribs and realizing it doesn't need improvement. The dirt doesn't care who you are, only that you fit. And for a species obsessed with height, skyscrapers, status, heavenly ascents, there's something almost sacred in returning to level. Across cultures, that final posture never changed. Burials still echo the sleeping form, fetal side-lying, arms folded. Civilization may have built its beds to defy gravity, but death insists on correcting the angle. And perhaps that's the secret comfort people sensed when they slept close to the ground. An ancient familiarity with endings. To lie down was to practice returning home. So after all the inventions, the springs, the foams, the golden frames, the smartest bed still looks exactly like the first one. A patch of earth, a whisper of grass, and the slow exhale of a creature remembering where it came from. The story of sleep, it turns out, isn't about comfort at all. It's about belonging, and the earth, patient as ever, has been waiting all this time, flat, forgiving, and perfectly shaped for rest. It's funny, really. Evolution had millions of years to prepare the human body for Ice Age weather, and somehow decided, let's go with mostly naked. No fur, no claws, no decent set of teeth, just soft skin, panic, and imagination. We were essentially thrown out of the animal kingdom's version of real estate. Everyone else got a built-in shelter, and we got an eviction notice with legs. So there we were, the naked ape, standing on a savanna where the sun could peel you alive by day and the wind could slice you open by night. It's almost endearing how unprepared we were. A chimp would have laughed if chimps understood irony. But instead of dying off, humans did something peculiar. We started using the body itself as a laboratory for survival. The absence of fur wasn't a flaw, it was an invitation. To sweat, to cool, to move endlessly without overheating. The skin became a canvas for adaptation, its pores tiny engines of endurance. Somewhere between a burning horizon and a freezing dusk, our ancestors figured out that the body could learn to do what fur once did. Fat turned into insulation, muscle became armor, And posture, that strange upright defiance against gravity, was the first architectural experiment. Standing tall helped us catch the wind, not hide from it. And as ridiculous as it sounds, we became masters of temperature, not through comfort, but through discomfort. It's hard to overstate what an evolutionary scandal sweating was. No other animal does it quite like us. Horses come close, sure, but they didn't take it to the level of leaking salt water like a badly sealed roof. Sweat allowed us to chase things longer than any predator could. It made the body a living cooling system, a mobile shelter that didn't need to stop moving to survive. The sun could burn, the wind could whip, and the body would simply say, "All right, let's adapt." But this transformation wasn't purely biological, it was psychological, even ritualistic. The idea that endurance itself was sacred, that survival was an act of devotion, began here. The body wasn't just flesh anymore, it was philosophy. To stand in the wind naked and not die became proof of something greater than survival. It was proof of memory, of learning, of self. And from there, flesh became fabric. The body started designing its own kind of clothing long before textiles arrived. Fat, muscle, heat, layers upon layers of living insulation. Not the kind you could take off, but the kind you had to grow. People who lived near the poles carried their shelter in their cells. Those closer to the equator carried it in the tone of their skin. Every shade, every contour, every scar was an architectural response to geography. Because the truth is, the body didn't just adapt, it remembered. Every pigment was a climate map, every callus a story of friction and endurance. Melanin wasn't decoration, it was an archive of light. It told the tale of who had walked too close to the sun, and who had lived in the kingdom of shadow. Skin became the oldest diary in human history, written not with ink, but with sunlight. And posture, that subtle miracle of balance, followed when the spine straightened and the ribcage rose. It wasn't vanity, it was shelter, a portable roof made of bone and breath. The pelvis laid the foundation, the ribs curved like domes, and the skull rested at the summit like a tiny temple for thought. The human body had, without realizing it, built its first house, one that could move, think, and rebuild itself daily. Strange, then, that the more we built outside ourselves, the less we trusted what was inside. The first shelter was flesh, the second, imagination. But before bricks, before fire, before any wall was raised, the body itself had already become the only home we truly owned. Fat was the first luxury humans ever owned. Not gold, not tools, just a soft, quiet layer that whispered, "You might survive the winter." It was the body's private savings account, stored beneath the skin, unspendable, except through hunger and time. And while modern culture treats it like a moral failure, ancient humanity treated it as divine proof that nature occasionally showed mercy. In cold climates, it meant life. A layer of warmth wrapped around the bones, sealing in heat like an animal pelt that grew from within. But fat wasn't just insulation. It was an act of rebellion against starvation. To carry it was to defy the fragility of the season. In Arctic communities, the rounded body wasn't shameful, it was ceremonial. The body became a shelter, a portable hearth that remembered abundance in the face of scarcity. Muscle joined the pact, not the sculpted vanity of gym mirrors, but the sinewy endurance of someone who'd walked for days across a horizon that never ended. Every tendon was a thread in the fabric of survival. It wasn't about strength, it was about persistence. A kind of quiet, rhythmic resilience that said, keep moving or die standing still. Movement itself became the most reliable form of shelter. The act of walking, running, hunting, all of it kept the inner fire alive. A body in motion could outlast predators that were faster, stronger, and far better equipped by nature. It was through sheer metabolic stubbornness that early humans conquered cold and distance. The body was its own tent, a vessel that warmed itself from friction and will. Even sleep, that fragile surrender, was a kind of maintenance ritual. The body cooled, repaired, adjusted the balance of heat and hunger. Dreams were perhaps the first weather reports. Flickers of danger, cold, or hunger turned into stories, so we could wake up smarter than we'd gone to sleep. And then there was the skin, that miracle membrane, stretched thin but fierce, humming with life. It breathed, it healed, it thickened in response to wind and work. The callus on a hand was not damage, it was architecture. The roughened heel, the leathery palm, the hardened shoulder, all of them were blueprints for a world that didn't care if you were comfortable. The skin learned to build without tools, but comfort was never the goal. The body's strange genius was its ability to find warmth in friction, safety in exposure, and identity in adaptation. And while other species wore their shelters by birthright, humans built theirs through effort. That's what made us dangerous and poetic, because once the body became its own fabric, it began to weave stories too. A scar wasn't just a wound. It was a narrative in raised relief. Every burn, bite, and bruise, a symbol of having endured something worth remembering. We didn't write history on walls first. We wrote it on skin, which leads, naturally, to the next paradox, the one where skin itself began to change, not just as protection, but as signal. As geography carved itself into pigment, and sunlight began to draw invisible borders on our bodies, skin has always been honest, brutally so. It remembers every season, every hour spent under an indifferent sky. Long before ink, it was the first surface to record where we'd been. The desert carved it bronze, the snow polished it pale, the equator etched it dark as the soil itself. It was climate made visible. Geography didn't just shape the land, it shaped us too, molecule by molecule, sunbeam by sunbeam. Melanin was the quiet archivist, not a decoration, but a ledger of light, a slow negotiation between the body and the sky. Too much sun, and it built defenses. Too little, and it eased its grip. No one designed it, no one approved it. It simply happened, like most of evolution's decisions, messy, practical, and far wiser than we are now. But the skin did more than react. It adapted with memory. A lineage could carry the echo of 1,000 suns long after it had moved to colder lands, which is why the skin often remembers what history forgets: migrations, exiles, hunger, crossing from shade into blaze. Each shade is a geological confession, proof that our ancestors once bartered with the light. It's strange to think that sunlight, that gentle murderer, could sculpt entire civilizations. Where the sun hit hardest, bodies became both shield and symbol. Where it rarely touched, people learned to chase it like a lost god. Even our myths began to orbit this relationship: the burn of divine punishment, the glow of holiness, the curse of darkness. Biology became theology in slow motion. And yet, for all its poetry, skin was also science. It regulated heat, managed water, sensed the invisible sweat glands, hair follicles, nerve endings, an entire ecosystem working without complaint. The skin didn't just contain us, it defined us. It was our border, our politics, our truth. But skin, being both wall and window, made us vulnerable to it, forced us to notice the elements, to crave shade, to worship warmth, to invent shelter. You can almost trace the birth of architecture to the moment someone realized the skin isn't enough. That realization that our bodies needed reinforcement led to a different kind of invention. The bones rose, the spine lengthened, and posture became the next layer of defense. Because when the body learned to stand tall, it wasn't showing off, it was building something. When humans first stood upright, it wasn't some triumphant moment of enlightenment. It was pure mechanical desperation. 4 legs were great for speed and stability, but standing freed the hands, widened the view, and, inconveniently, made us better targets for wind and rain. Yet, somehow, out of that gamble, posture became architecture. Think of the skeleton as our first construction project. The pelvis laid the foundation, sturdy, weight-bearing, unapologetically practical. Above it rose the spine, a flexible column capable of both grace and disaster. The ribs curved outward like a dome, sheltering the delicate machinery inside, and the skull sat at the top, the improbable cupola housing our most fragile illusions. The whole structure swayed slightly, like a tent in a storm, but it worked. We became walking cathedrals of bone. Standing upright also made us builders in a deeper sense. Once the body learned to balance itself, the mind began imagining other things that could stand. Trees became models for pillars, rib cages for domes, hands for arches. We didn't invent architecture, we remembered it. Every hut, every temple, every city was an echo of anatomy, scaled and stylized. The walls of ancient dwellings even curved like ribs, as if humanity couldn't stop copying itself. Of course, posture came with rent. Upright life demanded constant maintenance. The spine, that proud column, also became a lifelong complaint. Gravity gnawed at it. Age bent it back toward the ground we'd tried to escape. But even in decay, there's something poetic, as though every stoop is a quiet bow to the earth, an acknowledgement that all buildings eventually return to dust. And yet, the body found rhythm in the tension. Muscles tightened to hold the frame. Breath rose and fell to stabilize the structure. And movement, that subtle negotiation between collapse and grace, became our way of maintaining this living architecture. Even stillness was work. A person standing upright is, in truth, a person endlessly falling and catching themselves. Over time, this architectural posture gave birth to something even stranger, an internal sense of space. We began to feel the body as a place, an inside and an outside. Breath became a kind of wind moving through corridors of flesh. The chest, a room, the heart, a hearth. And when people finally built homes, they simply imitated what they already carried inside. Structure, warmth, protection, rhythm. It was breath, though, that animated it all, the invisible tenant moving through the house of bone. Breath kept the shelter alive, a constant tide rising and falling through invisible doorways. Breath is the one fire no one can see. It flickers quietly between ribs, warming the body from within. A slow, rhythmic combustion that turns air into life. Before humanity learned to master external flames, it had already been keeping one lit in the lungs. The lungs are strange architects, soft, spongy, and loyal. They take in the outside world and make it part of us. Every inhalation is a negotiation with the elements, a reminder that shelter was never meant to be sealed off, only filtered. The ancient yogis called it lull force, the Arctic hunters called it warmth, and the scientists, less poetically, call it oxygen exchange. But whatever the name, breath was our first central heating system. Early humans discovered that breathing wasn't just survival, it was control. In cold climates, hunters slowed their breath to preserve heat and patience. In the tropics, workers deepened it to endure humidity and exhaustion. Even ritualized breathing, the chants, the sighs, the synchronized murmurs around fires, created invisible architecture, shaping the emotional weather inside the body. The hearth and the lungs were mirrors. One fed the camp, the other fed the self. Breath is also the oldest language. Before speech, there were grunts, hums, and long exhalations that carried meaning long before vocabulary did. To share breath was to share spirit, a belief still embedded in languages that used the same word for both. To breathe near someone was intimacy. To steal someone's breath was power. Even today, a sigh across a quiet room says more than any sentence could. But breath is also memory. It remembers fear, holding itself hostage in shallow gasps. It remembers peace, uncoiling in long, careless exhales. The body, as shelter, keeps a record of every storm through the rhythm of its lungs. Even when the mind forgets, the breath tells on us. It's the first to tremble, the last to leave. And when humans finally learned to build fires, it was just an imitation of what was already happening inside. The crackling of logs was the external echo of a process we'd been rehearsing for millennia. We didn't invent warmth, we exhaled it. Of course, the body's genius didn't stop there. Once we could generate heat from within, we began to test how far that heat could go, how much pain, exhaustion, or endurance the body could hold before it broke. From that curiosity or madness emerged the rituals that turned flesh into temple, endurance into offering. At some point, survival stopped being enough. The body, always restless, started to look for meaning in its own limits. Pain, once a warning, became a doorway. Across continents, people discovered that the body could be more than a shelter. It could be a shrine, a place where suffering wasn't merely endured, but transformed into something holy. Endurance rituals were humanity's earliest architecture of transcendence. The scarifications of Africa, the fasting of the desert hermits, the firewalks and bone piercings of the Pacific, all of them were ways to build sanctuaries from flesh. Pain-carved corridors the mind couldn't build. The more the body trembled, the more it seemed to reveal. Anthropologists like to say that culture begins when discomfort becomes ritual. It's not a bad theory. When someone stands in the rain long enough to speak with gods, or bleeds to feel reborn, they're declaring that the body's threshold isn't a boundary, it's an invitation. Pain, in those moments, became the purest form of shelter. It enclosed the mind so tightly that everything else fell silent. Even today, traces remain. The marathon runner collapsing at the finish line, the ascetic fasting for clarity, the the dancer losing consciousness in a trance. All of them reenact that ancient belief that the body can contain revelation if it's emptied of comfort first. There's an irony there, the idea that to find peace, you must destroy the walls protecting you. But that's the human story in miniature, isn't it? Building, breaking, rebuilding, never quite sure which part is sacred. Ritual pain also created memory. The scars were not random, they were language. Each mark told a story of passage from child to adult, from mortal to divine, from inside to outside. The skin became a sacred ledger, the only kind of writing that couldn't be erased. Every civilization, in its own way, learned that endurance could be architecture, a cathedral built from heartbeat and discipline. But not all defenses were visible. Beneath the scars and stories, another kind of shelter was forming, one built not from pain, but from partnership. A quiet, microbial collaboration between the body and the earth. The skin, once thought to be a wall, turned out to be a living frontier, breathing, sweating, feeding invisible guests who guarded us from the world we feared. For most of history, cleanliness wasn't a virtue, it was a misunderstanding. The skin was never meant to be spotless. It was designed to host a small, invisible civilization. Bacteria, fungi, oils, salt, all in delicate negotiation. Every inch of us was a bustling village of microscopic life, working without thanks to keep invaders out, and balance in sweat was their irrigation system. It poured minerals and moisture through narrow channels, feeding entire colonies we didn't know we needed. The salt that stung your eyes, the dampness on your back, those were signs that the body's wall was alive. Dirt, far from being the enemy, was the oldest form of armor. A film of dust, oil, and bacteria kept the skin supple, acidic, and unwelcoming to the truly dangerous intruders. But then came soap. Civilization's obsession with purity wiped away more than grime. It dismantled an ecosystem. The industrial age, in all its perfumed arrogance, decided that sterility was health. We scrubbed until the body forgot how to protect itself. The irony, of course, is that the cleaner we became, the sicker we got. Allergies, sensitivities, autoimmunities, the quiet revenge of evicted tenants. Ancient people didn't have these problems. They understood the rhythm of filth. Hunters rolled in ash to mask their scent and absorb sweat. Desert travelers covered their skin in clay to reflect sunlight and preserve moisture. Arctic people let fat and soot seal warmth in. Their hygiene wasn't about removing the world, but blending with it. To be dirty was to belong. And yet, the body adapted again. It always does. The skin, patient as ever, kept repairing, rebuilding, remembering. It still learns the weather, adjusts the oils, negotiates with the unseen. Underneath the vanity and soap, it remains a shelter older than language, a breathing wall that's never stopped working, no matter how many times we try to scrub it away. At night, when the fires died and the air turned sharp, this wall did more than guard, it prepared for surrender, because even the strongest shelter must close its gates. And when the body finally lay down, it built its quietest refuge of all, the fortress of sleep. Sleep was humanity's nightly act of faith. Every time the body closed its eyes, it surrendered everything: sight, control, vigilance, trusting that the world wouldn't eat it before dawn. And yet, somehow, we survived. Enough times, in fact, that the ritual became instinct. The body learned to rebuild itself in darkness. Sleep wasn't rest, it was construction. Beneath the stillness, organs hummed like night shift workers. The brain sorted through memories, pruning what it didn't need. Muscles stitched their tears. The heart slowed to conserve fuel. Each night, the body folded itself inward, barricading the senses like a city under siege. The curled fetal position was the blueprint, a return to the first shelter we ever knew, the womb. Across ancient camps, people didn't sleep alone. They formed circles, a living architecture of warmth and sound. The elders at the edges, the children in the middle, like embers at the core of a dying fire. Their bodies shared heat, their breath mingled into a single rhythm. Sleep wasn't isolation, it was communion. The night air moved through them like wind through reeds, and in that collective murmur, safety took shape. Dreams, too, played their part. They were the mind's nocturnal architects, expanding the body's small shelter into vast symbolic landscapes. Through them, hunters rehearsed tomorrow's chase. Healers met their ancestors, and the frightened child faced down the monster that might visit again at dawn. The dream world was a kind of extension of the skin, porous, elastic, capable of holding entire worlds inside a heartbeat. Even predators learned to respect the silence of sleeping humans. A campfire might deter a beast, but there was something about the smell of shared rest, smoke, sweat, warmth, that signaled danger to anything hunting in the dark. Sleep, paradoxically, made us both vulnerable and untouchable. And when we finally began to build roofs and walls, we weren't trying to replace that safety, we were trying to imitate it. The hut, the cave, the house were physical versions of the same curled posture, a body folding in on itself to endure the dark. But as our shelters grew thicker, our faith in the body's own architecture began to fade. We extended it outward, in fabric, in stone, in ornament. Soon, the skin wasn't enough. We wrapped it in hides, then woven grass, then linen and wool. We inked it, pierced it, decorated it, until our second skin became art, history, and memory all at once. When the body began to clothe itself, it wasn't modesty, it was memory. Every thread, every hide, every painted mark was an echo of the old instinct to survive through layering. The skin had done its best for millennia, but at some point, imagination took over the job. Humans began to externalize their biology, turning necessity into expression. Clothing started as camouflage and warmth. Yes, fur against wind, bark against rain, but quickly became something stranger, identity. To cover the body was to declare allegiance, to sculpt meaning onto vulnerability. A cloak could signify power, a veil, submission, a color belonging. The first humans didn't just wear their shelters, they performed them. Tattoos came even earlier. Before fabric, before armor, people learned that the skin itself could be rewritten. A puncture, a pigment, a pattern, a permanent architecture. Tattoos were protection and proclamation at once, symbols of ancestry, initiation, or devotion. Each line was a kind of magic, a wall painted onto living mortar. To mark the skin was to say, "This shelter is mine, and I am its god." Piercings, jewelry, ornaments, all extensions of the same impulse. The body reached outward, experimenting with its boundaries. Metal became bone's companion, shell replaced tooth, leather embraced flesh. Tools, too, were extensions not of need, but of possibility. A flint knife was just a sharpened fingernail, a spear, a longer arm. Humanity's genius wasn't invention, it was elongation. In every tool and trinket, the same pattern emerges, the body trying to remember itself at a larger scale. The hut mirrored the rib cage. The drum echoed the heartbeat. The bowl was a cupped hand made permanent. Civilization didn't spring from inspiration, it unfolded from anatomy. But with every extension came distance. The further we projected our shelter outward, the less we listened to the one we already carried. Once we learned to build walls, we forgot to trust skin. Once we invented roofs, we forgot how to read the stars. And in that forgetfulness, comfort began its quiet conquest. The body that once survived through adaptation now flinches at inconvenience. What was once insulation became vanity. What was once endurance became anxiety. We've built fortresses so efficient that we've started to exile the very creature they were meant to protect. The body, our first home, has become the most neglected one. And so, in a final twist of irony, modern life finds itself shivering, not from cold, but from disconnection. The shelters grew taller, smarter, warmer, and the flesh beneath them forgot what warmth actually feels like. Somewhere along the way, the body retired from its own profession. It stopped being a shelter and became something we decorate, medicate, and outsource. Climate control replaced circulation. Pillows replaced posture. A thermostat now negotiates with the cold, and an app tells us when to breathe. The ancient partnership between body and world has gone silent to old friends who no longer speak. It's not that we've grown weaker, it's that we've forgotten what strength used to mean. Once, endurance was a quiet, daily ritual, walking barefoot on rough ground, feeling hunger and knowing it wouldn't kill you, sweating and trusting it to save you. Now, we flinch at drafts and call it self-care. We moisturize away the very oils that once defended us, sterilize our hands until the microbes surrender, and then wonder why we feel fragile. The modern body lives in exile inside its own architecture, wrapped in fabric, lit by screens, fed by processed sunlight. We have built shelters so perfect they have erased their purpose. Comfort became the new wilderness, a landscape where nothing hurts, nothing tests, and nothing quite feels real. We've replaced the poetry of the elements with the dull hum of appliances. Anthropologists of the future will probably look at us with pity, a species that conquered nature only to declare war on temperature. Our ancestors learned to make fire from friction. We panic when Wi-Fi flickers. The body's once divine ability to adapt is now treated as a flaw to be corrected, medicated, or optimized. And yet, under all the layers, it still remembers. The skin still senses the weather before the forecast does. The lungs still recognize the smell of rain. The muscles still ache for movement. The heartbeat still sinks to firelight. And the breath still builds warmth in the chest like a small, loyal sun. Evolution doesn't forget that easily. Perhaps that's the quiet truth, running beneath our steel and glass cities. The body is still waiting for us to come home. The architecture was never the house, it was the occupant. And though we've built worlds to keep it safe, the body remains what it's always been, the first and last shelter, the only one that moves with us.